wherever you are. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about the history of England or the UK, all right, through the lens of its rulers. But I'm going to do it in a funky way, in an autistic way, in a neurodivergent way, because that's what I am. I'm not going to do it in a chronological way. I'm going to rate all the firsts and seconds and thirds and fourths and fifths. And it's going to be a bit jumbled up here and there. But bear with me. It might be an easier way to learn. Yeah, when we compare all the various monarchs. And we're going to look at it this way. There are 7 very famous names throughout English monarchies. And when I say English, I include English and Scottish once it comes to Union of Crowns. So they are, by chronology, William, Henry, Richard, Edward, James, Charles, and George. Now, there are 4 Williams, 2 English Williams, and 2 British Williams, one of which, of course, is Dutch. There are 3 Richards, all English. There are 8 Edwards, 6 during the English period, and 7 and 8 during the British period. There are 2 Jameses, obviously from Scotland, and obviously after the Union of Crowns. We cannot exactly call them British because it's not the Union of Parliament yet. So it's Anglo-Scottish monarch. All right, James. Charles, there are 3. 2 during the Anglo-Scottish period, and 1 British, which is our current monarch. And George, there are 6, all during the British period. From George I, Georg of Hanover, to George VI, the mother of Queen Elizabeth II. So today I'm going to look at this rather unusual, what do you call it, schedule, what do you call it, a table, all right? I don't know what that means. Okay, reverse. What does that mean? Does that mean... you get to see it now. So here we have it. William, Henry, Richard, Edward, James, Charles, and George. Now I'm going to just read it out to you. William the Conqueror, he is known. Guillaume du Bâtard. Okay, he was known as William the Bastard. Most Norman kings were bastards back then, so he's no different. He is the first sovereign of the House of Normandy. He is preceded by King Harold II, the House of Wessex, the last dynasty of Anglo-Saxon England. And he's preceded by his son William II, the Rufus or Red King. His accession was that he won the Battle of Hastings in 1066. All right, and his death was basically got the date, was at the end of his reign. I'm going to look at the dates later on. Was at the end of his reign, and he was taken over by his son William I. Now he had 3 sons that became the kings of England, but we're talking about England and Normandy here, yeah? This is the first time when the English spoke Anglo-Saxon and Norman French together. Henry I. Henry I is the 3rd sovereign of the House of Normandy. He is the son of William I, Conqueror, and he was preceded by his brother, William II, the Red King. Red King because he had red hair. Some people thought that William II was homosexual. I'm not so sure. Anyway, so he is preceded by a time of chaos, where his brother Stephen of Blois became either King Stephen or his daughter, the former Empress of the of the Holy Roman Empire, Empress Matilda, was Queen of England. So we don't know whether Matilda was the first Queen of England or whether Stephen of Blois was the King of England at that time, because there was a lot of misunderstanding and mishaps here and there. But Henry I, known as Beauclerc, was also king during the time of the White Boat incident. Apparently, he died because he ate a lot of lampreys. It's a sort of eel-like fish. So eating a lot of that caused his death. So those who are lamprey lovers, remember moderation always, yeah? Now we go on to Richard I, Lionheart, in French, Cœur de Lion. All right, he's the 2nd sovereign of the Plantagenet dynasty, Plantagenet dynasty took over the Norman dynasty under Henry II, his father, and he's preceded by his father, Henry II, and he's preceded by John, his brother. His accession was on the death of his father, Henry II, and apparently he's known as a crusader king. And when he died, his brother took over from his reign. That is Richard I, Coeur de Lion, Lionheart, known as such because he fought the battle against Saladin in various parts of the Middle East. He was quite an absentee king, and it was during his time that you have the Robin Hood incidents. Yeah? Now, Edward I is known as Longshank because he was pretty tall. He is the fifth sovereign of the House of Plantagenet. He is preceded by Henry III, his father, and he was preceded by his son, Edward II. His accession to the throne was at the death of his father, Henry III, and he himself died, was taken over by his son, and he was known as the Imperator. Good morning to Guilherme Costa. Thank you for joining on this little history lesson. Yes, he's known as the Imperator of Britain. He was known as the Caesar of Britain, and the Scottish national anthem is sung with his son in mind. Proud Edward's army, and sent him homeward to think again. So that was because people were against Edward I, known as Longshanks. Now, then we go on to, so he had many problems. Thank you very much, everyone. Supreme God, thank you. He had many conquests. He conquered Wales. In fact, he was the one that stated that Princeps Walias is the person that will take over as the next the next king of England, because the Welsh kings and Welsh lords were trying to undermine Edward I during his conquest of Wales, and he said that Princeps Walias, which is Prince of Wales, will be accorded to the first son of the King of England. All right, so he is, yes, Edward I of England we're talking about here, Longshanks. Okay, next we are looking at all the firsts here. Okay, so Edward I, then we have James I, James I of Scotland and James I of Scotland, 6th of England, first sovereign of the Stuart dynasty, Stuart. He's preceded by Queen Elizabeth I, Tudor, and is preceded by his son Charles I. He was acceded to throne through the death of James I of England, and what am I talking about here? He accedes to the throne after the death of Queen Elizabeth because she had no heir. So he acceded as James I of England, 6th of Scotland. Brought up as a very much Protestant king, Presbyterian by George Buchanan, and his right of kingship was based on divine rights of kings, which of course his son took over. Now, he died and it was replaced by his son Charles I. Okay, then you have Charles I. Charles I is the second sovereign of the Stuart dynasty. He is preceded by James I of England, 6th of Scotland, and he was preceded by what we don't call as a kingdom, but we call as a commonwealth. In 1649, the King of Britain was beheaded by Act of Parliament after the Civil War, and Sir Oliver Cromwell took over as the chief, okay, as a Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. And this was regicide. So there was no king of England and Scotland from 1649 to 1659 after the murder, so-called, of Charles I, whose grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots, also got beheaded under the order of Elizabeth I. So like grandson, like grandmother, yeah? Only James VI was spared. He was the one in between. All right, so it was preceded by Sir Oliver Cromwell, and of course he acceded to the throne during the death of his father, James I of England and 6th of Scotland, and of course he was executed in 1649 as a stubborn king for divine rights of kingship. Parliament wanted rule, but he wanted something else. So you have the English Civil War between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The Roundheads are the parliamentarians headed by Oliver Cromwell, while you have the Cavaliers who were supporting King Charles I. All right, now we have, on the other side, we have George or Georg. Okay, George I is known as Georg of Hanover. He is the first king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, yet he could not speak English. He can only speak German. And he came from Hanover. He is the son of Electress of Hanover, Sophia. And because of the Protestant succession, they could not get anyone close to home. The closest they got was Georg of Hanover to be king of Britain. They did not want a Catholic king like James. They wanted a Protestant king. So the Prince of Hanover became the first king of Great Britain, King George I. Otherwise known as Georg of Hanover. He was not interested in Britain. He hardly could speak any English. And his heart was with Hanover and Germany. He is the first sovereign of the House of Hanover. He's preceded by Queen Anne, who is the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty. And he is preceded by his son George II. Okay, he is seated to the throne because of the Protestant succession after the death of Queen Anne in 1714. He is known as the first king of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the first king of the UK, because at this point, in 1707, under Queen Anne, the parliaments of Scotland and England unite after the dissolution of the Scottish Parliament in 1707. Daniel Defoe, the writer of Robinson Crusoe, once said, "This is the end of an old song." In 1707, the Scottish Parliament dissolved and only got rebirth in 1999 under the stewardship of First Minister Donald Dewar. But before that, Scotland and England shared a parliament, and it was called the British Parliament in Westminster. And of course, prior to that, prior to 1707, the Scottish Parliament was separate from the English Parliament, okay? And there was a parliament in Edinburgh. But the reason why they dissolved was because the Scottish people and the Scottish nation wanted to colonize Darien Peninsula in the area of Panama, today's Panama, just like the English had colonized Virginia and parts of eastern present-day United States as the 13 colonies of Anglo-America, because the Scots wanted to colonize Panama. Unfortunately, the colonization of Panama by the Scottish people was unsuccessful due to climate differences and all this, but a lot of money was lost in the Darien scheme. The result of that, together with many, many other things, caused for the dissolution of the Scottish Parliament in 1707. The end of an old song, indeed. And this was during the reign of Queen Anne. So, therefore, after that, we have Great Britain. No longer can you call it English, you can call it British, because it includes everyone, yeah? All right, let's go back in time to William again. Now we're looking at number 2. William II. William, Henry, Richard, Edward, James, Charles, and George. Okay, but all number 2s this time. Just now we're all the number 1s. So now we're looking at all the number 2s. William II, Rufus, is a Red King. He is the son of King William the Conqueror. He is the second sovereign of the House of Normandy. He's preceded by his father, William I the Conqueror, and preceded by his brother, Henry I, Beauclerc. His accession is because of the death of King William I. And William II died during a hunting accident in the forest. Some people said it was a conspiracy. Hunting trip. And was preceded by his brother, Henry I. Now let's look at Richard II. Oh, the case of Richard II is very, very sad. Sorry, we're not looking at Richard II, we're looking at Henry II. Sorry, we'll look at Henry first. Henry II is a very interesting king. Everyone thinks Henry VIII is interesting, but Henry II is equally interesting. Have you watched the movie Lion in the Winter, starring Patrick Stewart and Glenn Close? If you watch that movie, you would know that Henry II is indeed the father of Richard Lionheart and King John, and also Geoffrey, Duke of Gloucester. Duke of Clancy or Duke of Gloucester? No, he is the first sovereign of the Plantagenet dynasty, the son of Empress Matilda and the Duke of Anjou, which makes it the Plantagenet. You know, the Plantagenet flag has 3 lions, and there are 14 Plantagenet kings. 8 true Plantagenet kings, but 14 altogether because of the War of the Roses. It was split up after the death of Richard II in 1399. It was split up between the House of Lancaster and later on the House of York, and that's the War of the Roses, between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, which later on was solved by the accession of the Tudor dynasty. All right, which is Henry VII. So now we're back to Henry II, yeah? He is also the one who was involved with murdering the Archbishop. Okay, he said, would someone rid me of this turbulent priest? And the knights from the Crusades went storming into the cathedral in Canterbury and killed Thomas Becket at the altar. It was sacrilege. And the king wore a hair shirt and was having to do penitence for the sin of sacrilege. That is the sin of the murder of not just anyone, but the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. Because Thomas Becket was allowed, was this loud voice in the wilderness, like John the Baptist, you know. He was a loud voice in the wilderness and was criticizing the king of his every move. So King Henry II was just fed up with the whole thing, and knights took it upon themselves to murder the Archbishop. And this Archbishop didn't come from anyone. He came from the commoner in London. He was a commoner, yeah? Similar to Cardinal Wolsey, who was also the son of a butcher. Son of a butcher or baker, I'm not so sure. But he too was a commoner. So there were commoners that were allowed to be in high positions as a result of Christianity, yeah? Now, Henry II took over from his great uncle or mother, depending on who you vote for. Was Empress Matilda the Queen of England, or was King Stephen of Blois the King of England? We don't know. So, and then it was preceded by his son Richard I Lionheart, Coeur de Lion. His accession to the throne was on the death of his uncle and also his mother, and he was preceded by his son King Richard. Of course, Richard II now. Richard II is the 8th sovereign of the House of Plantagenet. He is said to be the last true Plantagenet king. His poet is a man called Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer. And he was preceded by Edward III, his grandfather, who was a very long reign. He had a very long reign from I'm not so sure the dates are there, up to 1377, yeah? Many, many decades. Edward III was a very good king, yeah? And it was preceded by that. But Richard II, if you remember, in 1381, there was a man called Wat Tyler. Wat Tyler was brought all the farmers and all these people, and this was the time of the Black Plague. So poor people were dying by the millions. Poor people were dying a lot, whereas those who were in the castles and protected, you can see all these women wearing these interesting clothes, you know, like Cinderella's time. That was the time of King Richard II. And Wat Tyler said, are we not equal? Are we not all human beings? Should we not be treated fairly? And King Richard listened to him. But as soon as Wat Tyler went away, he persecuted the rest of the mob that was there. So that was how he was. He was this kind of bipolar personality. All right. If he's being shouted at, he would take it in, but yet he would lambast other people. And of course, he was into building his own image up. There were pictures of him with the Holy Mother and angels, all according power to him. However, he was smothered in the Tower by his very own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who felt that he was legitimate for the heir, and that's the usurpation. And Henry Bolingbroke was related to the House of Lancaster, which is an arm of the family of the Plantagenets. And now we come into the House of Lancaster underneath the Plantagenet rule under Henry IV Bolingbroke. Henry IV took over from King Richard II. Now, a similar Richard would be doing the other way around. Richard II received the smothering and died, whereas Richard III is said to have smothered his own nephew in the Tower of London. So the Richard III is different from Richard II. Yeah, there are two very different Richards there. Edward II. Edward II is the 6th sovereign of the Plantagenet house. He's preceded by Edward I, His father is said to have been homosexual, and because of that, his wife, Queen Isabel, poked him with the poker, and that's how he died, up the backside. And he's preceded by his son, Edward III. His accession is at the death of Edward I. His father says that I may die conquering Scotland, but you will then wash my bones in hot water and bring it up to Scotland so that you conquer in my stead. Unfortunately, Edward was still able to conquer Scotland because of the failure of William Wallace, Braveheart. But Edward II came up against Robert the Bruce, and the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1320 and 1314 ousted the whole English army, and Scotland gained its freedom at last under Robert the Bruce. Edward II is in that song, in the national anthem that the Corries made, yeah, of Scotland. He is proud Edward, yeah. Now he was executed by his wife for infidelity, by Queen Isabella, okay, and he was preceded by his son Edward III. That's Edward II. James II of England, 7th of Scotland, is the very object of Jacobitism. The word Jacobus means James. So the supporters of James are the Jacobites. Watch Outlander. Hashtag and shout out to Outlander. Watch the Battle of Culloden, the battle between the Jacobites under Prince Charles, Bonnie Prince Charlie, or Carluso as he was called by his mother, his Polish mother. He is actually the grandson of James II. All right, ousted during the Glorious Revolution of 1688 by his own daughter, who was married to the Dutch king, William of Orange. So James II of England and 7th of Scotland is the second sovereign of the Stuart dynasty restored. Remember, after the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell, there is a restoration of the royal house in 1660 when Charles II ascended the throne. And after Charles II died in 1685, James II of England and 7th of Scotland ascended to the throne and was exiled to France because he was Catholic. All right? He was preceded by his brother, Charles II, and preceded by two monarchs. William III, who is Prince William of the House of Orange-Nassau, the Netherlands, and his wife, Mary II. Now, obviously he acceded to the throne at the death of his brother, but he was ousted and exiled to France during what is called the Glorious Revolution and the Dutch conquest of England in 1688. The Glorious Revolution was called such because Parliament, for once, wanted to make sure that the will of the king was not equal to the will of the country. Before this, the will of the king and the will of the country was inseparable. But now the king and the country was different. The king was constitutional, which means Parliament reigned above the king. Constitution reigned above the king. And if you want to do something about the law, you have to go through an act of Parliament, which of course the king will reside over. That's called a constitutional monarchy. Not an absolute monarchy like King Louis XIV in France, who was contemporary to King James, was an absolute monarch. And like the Sultan of Brunei today, it's an absolute monarchy, where the king's will is the will of the country. There is no difference. All right, that's not democracy, that's royal, absolute royal assent, yeah? So can you imagine the daughter usurps the father off the throne, and the father went there. Now, I was wondering, why is the Protestant succession such an important topic in 1688 and not in 1685? Because he acceded to the throne as a Catholic monarch who was married to a former Protestant princess, Anne Hyde, in 1685. But now, when he married Mary of Modena, I think Anne Hyde must have passed away since then. I'm not so sure about that. But Mary of Modena, his second wife, was an Italian Catholic, and he was Catholic too. Now, they had a son, you see, Francis Edward Stuart. And when the birth of Francis happened, the heir was Catholic. So that, maybe that Catholic inevitability of the monarchy is what caused for the Glorious Revolution to happen, so that Protestant succession is confirmed. Because without Protestant succession, you cannot be the head of the English church and yet be Catholic. You know, it doesn't suit. You have to be an Anglican monarch in England, at least since the time of Henry VIII. All right. So that is James II. And of course, many people supported him. Charles II, okay, we're not going... Charles II actually is before James II. He's the first sovereign of the Stuart house restored, and the third sovereign of the Stuart house in general. He's preceded by Sir Richard Cromwell, the son of Oliver Cromwell, at the time of the Commonwealth, and preceded by James II of England and 7th of Scotland. He acceded after the Stuart Restoration, when monarchy at the end of the Commonwealth of the Cromwells, due to the weakness of Oliver's son Richard. Richard was not able to upkeep the same kind of tenacity as his father Oliver. So eventually the crown was restored in Scotland and then in England by 1660. And of course his end was his death, and of course his brother took over as James II. Next one is George II. George II is the second sovereign of the House of Hanover, and is preceded by his father George I, and he's preceded by his son George III. Okay, he acceded at the death of his father, and of course by his death his son took over. I'm not going to mention much about George II. I'm not so sure whether it was George III or George II and George I when the Battle of Culloden took place. The Battle of Culloden took place in 1746 and was fought between the redcoats that supported the King George and supported Britain as it was under King George, but the Jacobite rebels were Scottish Highlanders who supported the Jacobite accession, which means they wanted the son or grandson of the exiled King James to return to Scotland. These were Jacobites. After the end of 1746, Scottish customs were outlawed, the Gaelic language was outlawed, the wearing of tartan was outlawed until the time of George IV. And the reason why all these things were outlawed, it allowed the landlords to also clear the highlands of people, and that's known as the Highland clearances. It's a very sad time at the late part of the 18th century. Today we go to the Highlands of Scotland and we see a very vast empty space. In the past that place was actually much filled with different clan peoples and so forth. But they were cleared because of the anti-Scottish sentiment that came about at the end of the Jacobite rebellion. We know that Prince Charles, Bonnie Prince Charlie, was dressed like a woman and brought over to the sea, to Skye. There's a song, speed bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry, carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to Skye. So that song is actually used as the theme for shout out to the Netflix hit Outlander. Okay, I've watched it all. I've watched all of Outlander and I really like it. It's very bloody, but it talks about that time, okay, that season, or the time of George II and George I, and the time of the Jacobite uprising, 1746. Right. So now we're going to number 3. Just now we're on number 2. They're all 2s, yeah? Although William Henry Richard, Edward, James, Charles, and George. Now we come down to William Henry Richard, Edward, Charles, and George, because James stops at 2. William III, he is the first and only sovereign of the Dutch royal house of Orange-Nassau from the Netherlands, yeah? And he was co-sovereign with Mary II, his wife, who is the third sovereign of the Stuart dynasty restored and fifth sovereign of the Stuart house. And she was preceded by her father, James II of England and 7th of Scotland, the object of Jacobitism. and preceded by her sister Queen Anne. She acceded on invitation by Parliament to oust her father, King James II of England, 7th of Scotland, due to the Protestant succession, otherwise the birth of Francis Edward Stuart, yeah? And she died in 1690, sorry, William III died in 1702, but his wife died in 1694. In 1702, he fell off the horse because a mole came out from the ground. And the Jacobites say, that bonny wee mole. And they celebrate that mole on Burns's night. Not Burns's night, they celebrate the mole in their Jacobite tradition. That ended. But during the time of William III, when he reigned alone, from 1694 to 1702, there was much despair among the Jacobites, because here you have a Dutch king ruling Britain. But prior to that, in 1692, 2 years prior, there was a story, hashtag Massacre of Glencoe. The story happened because the Clan MacDonald of Glencoe could not give their allegiance to King William in time. So they were made an example of. And the choristers have a song like that. Slaying Glencoe and murdered the house of MacDonald. Oh, cruel was the cruel that slay Glencoe and murdered house of MacDonald. Something like that. It came in. Anyway, it's a lovely song. Hashtag to Corries. Talk about the massacre of Glencoe. Yes, the Highlanders came. Campbells came and he drank their drink and slept in their grounds and had parties with them, and the full Highland hospitality was given to the Campbells. But then there was one night where the order was given to slay all the members of the MacDonalds of Glencoe. Harsh it was in 1692, in the snow-covered fields of Glencoe, where all the bloody corpses of the House of MacDonalds lay there. So that's why the MacDonalds and the Campbells. My grandfather, and by the way, I am partly Scottish myself, my mum coming from Glasgow, my dad coming from Borneo, Sarawak, so hashtag both Sarawak in Scotland. There was this, so there we go, Glencoe. My grandfather said that during when he was a worker, he had a Campbell and he had a McDonald's, and he said, "I won't turn my back on you, Campbell, because of the grievances of the house of the grievances during that time in 1692. Scots don't forget, do they? All right, let's come back to this. So let's take a look at the number threes, shall we? So we have William III, then we have Henry III. Henry III is the fourth sovereign of the Plantagenet house. He's preceded by his father John, King John. We'll call it a bad King John, John Lackland. Henry III was a man who helped with the expansion and development of monasteries and churches around England. But I believe that at that time they still spoke Norman French in court. It was only his son Edward I that started to re-anglicize the court and make it English. Henry III was also supervised by Simon de Montfort. But that supervision so much ruined Henry III that the first thing Edward I did upon acceding to the throne was to kill Henry III. How? Hung, drawn, and quartered. Just like William Wallace. Hung, drawn, and quartered. They would hang you, they would draw you out, your guts and all that, and then they would cut you up into 4 pieces and scatter you around the kingdom. Hung, drawn, and quartered. Not a very pleasant way to die, is it? So, so this time the accession of, death of Father King John created an end towards a time when English nobles were still seeking Scottish help due to John's tyranny. So at that time they were seeking help from King Alexander II of the House of Canmore. But when King John died, the English nobles turned back to honor and pay homage to their new king, Henry III. And upon his death, his son Edward took over. All right, next one. Richard III, the third sovereign of the House of York, a subsidiary of Plantagenet, and the 14th and last sovereign of the Plantagenet dynasty. He was preceded by Edward V, who is the son of his brother, whom he smothered in the Tower. These were the boys in the Tower. There was Richard and Edward in the Tower. All right, so Richard III smothered the boys in the Tower. Tragedy. But there are many Ricardians today that are trying to restore his name from Tudor history. He was preceded by Henry VII, Tudor. His accession was by murdering the boy in the Tower, Edward V, his nephew, and he died by being killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. And then thus happened the Tudor accession. Okay, Richard III. Edward III is the seventh sovereign of Plantagenet. He's preceded by Edward II, who is his father, and he was preceded by Richard II, his grandson, through the Black Prince. His accession was upon the death of his father, who was murdered by his mother, and he died. When he died, of course, his grandson took over. But the era of Edward III is a time of stability. Edward III and Queen Philippa. Yeah. All right. There's a lot more. Actually, there's a lot more from what I'm saying. I'm just summarizing. Okay. Now we have Charles III, fourth sovereign of Windsor and the current king of the UK. He's preceded by his mother Elizabeth II, and maybe preceded by his son William V, perhaps? Maybe. His accession was the death of his mother in September 2022, and his possible death, he'll be replaced by his son. We don't know. Okay, so that's current. Charles III. George III is the third sovereign of the House of Hanover, and he's the king that lost America. I would suggest shout out to YouTube to the movie Mad King George. Nigel Hawthorne plays King George III, while his wife Queen Charlotte is played by Helen Mirren. Also shout out to the Queen, that was also played by Helen Mirren, and Queen Elizabeth I is also played by Helen Mirren. So she's a very good actress at playing the Queen. This one he calls her husband Mr. King. And Rupert Everett is George IV, or the son. Shout out also to Blackadder III, which depicts comically how George IV was like in court as Prinny. Now, George III was a mad king, and he was mad possibly maybe because he lost British America. I'm not so sure, but the United States was born under his reign, yeah? He was preceded by his father, George II, and he's preceded by his son, George IV. All right. Now we come to William. Now we go back to number 4. Now we're in number 4. We did number 3, now we're doing number 4. Number 4, we have William IV, Henry IV, Edward IV, George IV. All right. Charles and Richard stops at 3. William IV is the 5th sovereign of Hanover, preceded by George IV, and who was his brother, and he was preceded by his niece Victoria. He acceded with the death of his brother George IV, and he died giving way to our Queen Victoria. That's King William IV. He has an egg-shaped like head, you know? And you tend to see him in programs about Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is the daughter of Edward, Duke of York, who was married to Queen Victoria's mother. I've got the name. But he died when Princess Victoria was only 1 year old in 1820. And ever since then, John Conroy and Queen Victoria's mother were to look after the babe. But she felt that she was abused at that time, and when she became queen in 1837, after the death of William IV, we have she was independent of thought. But her mentor was Lord Melbourne, yeah, the Prime Minister at the time. Now, let's look at Henry IV. Henry IV Bolingbroke, first sovereign of the House of Lancaster, the Red Rose, a subsidiary of the Plantagenet House, and 9th sovereign of Plantagenet. He was preceded by King Richard II, whom he smothered, and he was preceded by his son Henry V. I will shout out to the movie Henry V, starring Timothy Chalamet. on Netflix as well. Very good movie indeed. All right. You get to see the old Henry IV there. He's more like a villainous king, He doesn't really wear a crown, sort of thing. But he murdered his cousin to get to the throne. A usurpation that happened in 1399. And with his death, his son took over. That's Henry IV. Edward IV is the first sovereign of the House of York, a subsidiary of the Plantagenet line, and 12th sovereign of Plantagenet. He's preceded by Henry VI, who was also his rival and distant relative. And he was preceded by Henry VI, and there were changes. So actually, Edward IV has two reigns, 1460 to 1470, and 1471 to 1483. The reason why the reign is split is because Henry VI was sovereign before 1460, and he came back as sovereign in 1470 to 1471, when finally he was bludgeoned to death in the Tower by order of Edward IV. And guess who the henchman was? Richard, maybe. Practice before he kills his nephew, yeah? All right, so Edward IV is the brother of King Richard III, yeah? So, yeah, the brothers, yeah. Edward IV is the grandfather through the maternal line to Henry VIII. Now, okay. So these basic various changes happened because at this time it was due to the catatonic states of Henry VI, who was a catatonic king just like that, staring into the wall the whole time, and an inability to rule. But also there was a conflict that was happening between the House of Lancaster and York. The House of York represents the plight of King Richard II, whereas the House of Lancaster represented the plight of the usurpation of Henry IV. So there was constant battling between these two houses during this time, during the 1460s and 70s, which is why there was these changes that were happening during the time of Henry VI and Edward IV. Now, coming back here, George IV, he's one of my favorite kings actually, George IV. A lot of people said he was lazy, fat, took drugs, took alcohol, but so is any merry fellow, yeah? But why I liked him a lot was because, remember I told you about the anti-Scottish sentiment? George IV restored the pro-Scottish sentiment. I mean, you now find that the royals love Balmoral, they love Scotland, they love the Highland Games, some of them wear the tartan. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother is Scottish, and there's a huge connection with Scotland. Why is that? I mean, even our former Queen Elizabeth II loved Scotland so much, she even died there. So, but why the love for Scotland? It came from the time of King George IV. King George IV was about to visit Scotland, and in his merriment, he colluded somewhat with the writer Sir Walter Scott, who used the king's visit in the 1820s as a time to promote Scottish culture. People were allergic to tartan, Gaelic, and all the Scottish culture because of Jacobitism. But Jacobitism is something that happened in 1746, not 1820. So the 1820s is 80 years later. People have forgotten about all of that, and they want a kind of restored thing. But what we consider as popular culture in Edinburgh today, where you see people selling tartans and clans and all that, came from the reconstruction of Scottish culture during the King's visit to Edinburgh. So shout out to Sir Walter Scott, Waverley, and the visit of King George IV to Edinburgh, which reignited the love of the royal family for Scotland. And he was a Hanover king. He was preceded by his father, who lost America, George III. He's preceded by his brother, William IV. And he acceded to the throne at the death of George III, his father. And his brother is known for his boisterous character, love of Scotland and culture, as well as a romanticist king. This is a time of romanticism in Britain. Hashtag and shout out to Ghost. Have you ever watched this, the series called Ghost? It's about it's a British comedy, and there are ghosts from various times of British history living in one particular manor that a black man and his girlfriend, who's an English girl, took over and bought. And she can see the ghosts because she had an accident where she was able to open her third eye and see all these ghosts. and she interacts with them very funnily. There's one that came from the Romanticist period that was going after her. His English was very good, and so he's just one of the characters. And there's a character from the First World War. There's a character from the from Edwardian times. There's a character from the Stone Age. There's a character from the time of the time of King James, the Stuart times, and they all come with their own perks. Okay. At the same time, there was an entire village hit by the Black Plague that's in the basement, full of those ghosts. So it's quite a funny do. I would hashtag for you to watch that. Okay, so there you go. Those are the fourths. Now we come up to the fifths. Henry V. So you have Henry, Edward, and George still left, because there are 6 Georges, 8 Edwards, and 8 Henrys. Henry V is the 2nd sovereign of the House of Lancaster, subsidiary of the Plantagenet, and 10th sovereign of the Plantagenet. He is preceded by his father, Henry IV, preceded by his son, Henry VI. Accession death of his father, Henry IV. Shout out to that movie, Henry V, starring Timothy Chalamet, and of Charlie and Chocolate Factory fame. All right, and also of Don't Look Up. So we look at Henry V. He was a very handsome young king, and he fought bravely, and he won the Battle of Agincourt in France. And also one thing was he kept the King James I of Scotland captive in his court. And he wanted to release James I of Scotland so that James V of Scotland would eventually ask the Scottish people to support him in his campaigns against the French. However, Scotland at that time was very much ruled by the will of the Scottish people, including, of course, the Clan Donald of the Highlands, yeah, Inish Girl in the Hebrides, yeah. You had the Lord of the Clans, yeah. So Scotland wasn't exactly a kingdom in the same sense as England. There was a lot of voices in the Scottish court, in other words. So the Scots would have that odd alliance with France and refuse to be conscripted by King James under the influence of Henry V. All right. Now we have, he's known as the King of Agincourt's victory against the French. Now we have Edward V, 2nd sovereign of House of York, a subsidiary of Plantagenet, and 13th sovereign of Plantagenet. Preceded by Edward IV, the father, and preceded by Richard III, his uncle. His accession was during the death of his father, Edward IV, but however, from April to July, I believe, of 1483 was his reign, and it ended with the murder in the Tower with his brother Richard, Duke of York, by his uncle Richard, regent of the king, who later became Richard III. All right, thank you very much for watching. Willem. Okay, so coming out now to George V. George V is the 3rd sovereign of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha dynasty. Hi there, Dafinka. Masadeva. Hi, hello, hi. Welcome. George V is the 3rd sovereign of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and the 1st sovereign of the House of Windsor. He is preceded by Edward VII, his father, and preceded by Edward VIII, his son. He acceded at the death of his father, Edward VII, in 1910. So his time was from 1910 to 1936, George V, yeah? And he's the founder of the House of Windsor and known by Queen Elizabeth II as Grandpa England. Now, there's something about George V that is a bit dark. In 1917, his cousin, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and Tsarina Alexandra asked for help. Unfortunately, help was not given, and the Tsars were shot in Yekaterinburg by the Soviet army in 1917. Hashtag out to the Romanov dynasty. Yeah. So some people blame George V for not helping his cousin. By the way, they both look quite similar, you know. George V also the reason why he changed his dynasty, I think I have it here somewhere. I think I'm going to read it further down. Later I'll read it. Right now I won't be reading it. So later we'll talk about it. Something about the fall of all the dynasties around the world. And he didn't want to go, so he had to change the name to Windsor. So that's number 5. Number 6, we have Henry, Edward, and George. Henry VI is the 3rd sovereign of the House of Lancaster, a subsidiary of Plantagenet and the 11th sovereign of Plantagenet. He's preceded by Henry V, who's the father, who's his father, and he was preceded by Edward IV, though he preceded Edward IV at one point as well in 1470. So he was finally preceded by Edward IV due to the War of Roses, and during the changes as well, right? He acceded to the throne at the death of his father, Henry V, and he was bludgeoned to death by Edward IV, henchman, notably possibly Richard III, in the Tower. Lots of things happened in that tower. Due to his ineptitude and incapacity to rule, due to his catatonic states, Henry VI was known as the catatonic king, constantly petrified, unable to move. Edward VI, this is the long-awaited successor of King Henry VIII, yeah? Edward VI is the 3rd sovereign of Tudor, the House of Tudor. His father is Henry VIII, and he was preceded by Jane Grey, his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, due to the Protestant secession. He died at a very young age, and instead of giving the throne to his sisters, he reverts to giving it to his Protestant cousin, mainly in angst against his Catholic sister Mary, who is the granddaughter of the founders of modern Spain. Right, and he's known as the English reformist king. Right, he once said a lot of bad things about the Pope. George VI. George VI is the 3rd sovereign of the House of Windsor. He is preceded by his son Edward VIII, who is his brother. Sorry, he's preceded by his brother. Sorry, not son. I get into the habit of saying son, so I apologize for that. No, Edward VIII was his older brother, David, yeah? And he was preceded by his daughter Elizabeth II. He acceded to the throne because marrying a divorcee, Wallis Simpson, Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister of Britain, suggested that Edward VIII abdicate the throne because this woman was twice divorced, and you could not have a divorcee as a co-sovereign monarch. Yet, of course, there are issues today with Camilla, but that's something separate. As you know, this sort of thing happened a lot then. Edward VIII abdicated only after 8 months of reign, and George VI acceded to the throne in 1936. He died of cancer in 1952, and he was known as the Stuttering Geordie because he had a stutter. Hashtag and shout out to the movie King's Speech, okay, where you see Colin Firth acting as George VI and Helena Bonham Carter acting as Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother. She's not really Queen Mother then, she was the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen. And they were king and queen during the Second World War, yeah? He's also known as the wartime king. From 1939 to 1945, he died of cancer in 1952. Now we go into number 7. Number 7, we have Henry VII is the 1st sovereign of Tudor. By the way, you can get this document that I have. Okay, if you want the document, come and email me or message me for this document. If you want it out, you don't have to just rely on my speaking. And if you want a tutorial of history, you can also ask for my help. Yeah, the document is for free. Okay, but I do charge $30 American dollars for a one-to-one history class on Zoom. Right, Henry VII is the 1st sovereign of Tudor. He's preceded by Richard III, uncle-in-law, because Henry's wife Elizabeth of York was the sister to the boys in the Tower who were murdered by their uncle. And he's preceded by his son Henry VIII. Now, he acceded after winning the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 against the Plantagenet House of York, headed by Richard III, and united the factionalism caused by the War of the Roses. By marrying Elizabeth of York, he became, the Tudor Rose became a mixture of him representing the House of Lancaster and his wife representing the House of York. So it became the Tudor Rose, thus uniting it and ending the War of Roses for good. All right, it's all right. Goodbye, Dafinka. No, okay, no worries. All right, so, and he died, and his son, Henry VIII, was advised to seek a male heir, and that was his obsession from that point onwards. Hashtag and shout out to the movie by Helena Bonham Carter as Anne Boleyn and Rod Steiger as Henry VIII, and David Suchet as Cardinal Wolsey in the movie Henry VIII. There you get to learn all about Henry VIII, yes? It's a very good one. Now, but here is Henry VII, yeah? Then we have Edward VII, who is the second sovereign of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. He was preceded by his mother, Queen Victoria, in 1901, when she died, and was preceded by his son, George V, in 1910, after he died. He seated the throne. Some people called him Jack the Ripper, or some people thought that King Edward VII, as prince, was Jack the Ripper. Don't know. Anyway, he died in 1910 to his son. But he was a jolly old king, and if you look at his wife, Queen Alexandra, you do see quite a youthful woman, right up until the time she died in 1925, or was it 26, just before the birth of Queen Elizabeth. So that's Queen Alexandra of Denmark, yeah? So, all right. Now we go on to number 8. Number 8, we have Henry VIII, and we have Edward VIII, yeah? Only the Henrys and Edwards go up to 8. Henry VIII is the second sovereign of the Tudor dynasty, preceded by his father, Henry VI, and preceded by his son, Edward VI. Preceded by his father, Henry VII, sorry. Not Henry VI, Henry VII, and preceded by his son, Edward VI. His accession is due to the death of Henry VII. Known for his multiple marriages and wives, initial reformer of the Anglican Church. And his first wife is Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, who united the Iberian states to form Spain after the fall of the Islamic Moorish state. She is mother of Mary Tudor, the penultimate Catholic, and divorced. All right. Not successfully, though, through papal interdict. So Henry VIII, okay, had to split with the Catholic Church in order to remarry. All right. Eventually, he married Queen Anne Boleyn, mother of Elizabeth Tudor. She's the catalyst for Protestantism, but she was beheaded under the charge of incest and treason, and also for not being able to produce a male heir. Jane Seymour was replaced her, and she's the mother of Edward VI, died in childbirth to the said monarch. Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose lawyers tried to secure the marriage even though the king disliked her, and Thomas Cromwell, who designed it all, was beheaded for arranging this marriage, according to the movie, of course. Catherine Howard is Catholic wife of Henry VIII, but was too young to conceive with them. There's a conspiracy to unite her with her young boyfriend to produce an heir in absentia of the king, but they were caught and punished. Like Lord Culpeper, who was her boyfriend, she was beheaded with him. Catherine Parr was supposed to be wed to Thomas Seymour and acted as a nurse to the dying and ailing king when he died in 1547. So Henry VIII ruled from 1509 to 1547. Edward VIII is the second sovereign of Windsor, preceded by his father George V, and preceded by his brother George VI. He seated the throne at the death of George V in January 1936, and the father caused him to accede to the throne. Okay, but he died. But because he married the twice divorced Wallace Simpson, the British establishment under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin forced him to abdicate. He died in the early 1970s, only still loving his wife Wallace Simpson, who died later. There was an interview in the 1960s between between the Duke of Windsor and the press. Yeah. All right, now we're going to go on to another section. Male kings or leader of different names. So besides William, Henry, Richard, Edward, James, Charles, and George, who have repetitive titles, we have these three otherwise names, like Stephen of Blois, John, and Sir Oliver Cromwell. I didn't write about Richard Cromwell, never mind. Stephen of Blois, fourth sovereign of Normandy, he preceded by his son Henry I Beauclerc, brother, and he was concurrently ruling with Empress Matilda, who is his niece. He was preceded by Henry II of the House of Anjou, Plantagenet, who is his grandnephew. His accession was consistent struggle with supporters and geographic dominion of his niece Empress Matilda, whilst ruling as king after the death of his brother Henry I. And during his death, and the grandnephew take over at the end of the Norman dynasty. That happened in 1154. Okay. King John is the third sovereign of Plantagenet, preceded by Richard I Lionheart, preceded by Henry II. Son, preceded by Henry III. Preceded by Richard I, Lionheart, and preceded by Henry III, his son. He acceded during the Crusades. He was regent for the absent King Richard I and took over after Richard's death. He was a tyrant king that needed control via the Magna Carta, and English nobles sought Scottish assistance in Alexander II due to his tyranny. However, after his death, they returned to pay homage to his son Henry III. All right. Last one, Sir Oliver Cromwell, first parliamentarian to end royal rule in the form of the English Commonwealth. He's preceded by King Charles I, enemy and antagonist of parliamentary rule, and preceded by his son Richard, son and fellow parliamentarian. He acceded to the throne. He came to power after the English Civil War, was won by the Roundheads, or parliamentarians, who executed the king for treason against the state in 1649. And of course, his death was preceded by his son, who of course was too weak and later was preceded by the royal restoration of the Stuarts in 1660. Now take a look at some women, yeah? We have Mary and Elizabeth, which both go twice over. Mary I is known as Bloody Mary, the fifth sovereign of Tudor. She's preceded by Lady Jane Grey, her cousin, and preceded by Elizabeth I, her sister. Her accession is usurpation of Lady Jane Grey's reign after 1 week. She restored the Roman Catholic Church in England. Counter-Reformation persecution was the bane of her reign, where she put to the stake people like Thomas Cranmer for being a heretic. And she married Philip II of Spain, who named the Philippines after him. The Philippines was named after him. And she died due to having thought that she was going to bear a child, but instead it was a tumor. And her sister Elizabeth took over. Shout out to the movie by Kate Blanchett, Elizabeth. You get to see the end in 1558 of Mary's reign and the start of Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth I, the glorious monarch of the Golden Age, the monarch of the time of William Shakespeare, the monarch of the time of Sir Francis Drake, defeating the Spanish Armada. It was an amazing time and a glorious reign in England. So much so, Virginia is not named after the Holy Mother, but was named after the Virgin Queen of England, Elizabeth. Take that into it. And it was a time of English plantation in America. Elizabeth I, she is the sixth sovereign of the Tudor dynasty, last sovereign of the Tudor dynasty, preceded by her sister Mary I, and preceded by James VI of Scotland and James I of England, who was the son of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who was beheaded at Fotheringay Castle in 1587 for high treason against the Queen. A queen killing another queen, can you imagine that? So she acceded to the throne at the death of her sister Mary I, who died due to cancer, and she restored the Protestant faith and cultivated the Anglican Church. It was the era of English supremacy of the seas, People like Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe and the supremacy of letters under Sir William Shakespeare, and England's takeover from the Iberian powers as an imperial power to contend with. She died without an heir, and her cousin's son took over, and it was the end of the Tudor dynasty in 1603. Mary II. Mary II is the third sovereign of the Stuart dynasty restored and fifth sovereign of the Stuart, reigning concurrently with her husband William III of the Dutch royal house of Orange-Nassau. She was preceded by her father James II of England and 7th of Scotland, and preceded by her husband, who ruled on his own, who was known as William III, King of Orange. She acceded to the throne, her accession here, under Protestant succession, when her father, James II of England and 7th of Scotland, an outright Catholic, had an heir in 1688. Parliament demanded that King William III and Queen Mary II conquer England, and it was known as the Dutch Conquest, or the Glorious Revolution, to restore parliamentary prowess without disturbing the monarchy, and redefining monarchy as constitutional and not absolute in the scope of power. Now, the old king was exiled to France, and the cause to raise him or his successors to the British crown became known as Jacobitism, after the Latin for James, which is Jacobus. Now, she died. Her death enabled her husband, as King of the Netherlands, to rule Britain single-handedly until his own death in 1702. So her husband took over. That's Mary II, yeah? So there's Williamsburg in America, named after William, and Maryland, possibly named after Queen Mary. There's even a college called William and Mary. Elizabeth II, the fourth sovereign of Windsor, preceded by George VI, her father, and preceded by her son, Charles III. She acceded to the throne at the death of George VI from cancer in 1952. Elizabeth acceded to the throne of the UK, and it's the longest reign until the year 2022. She died in September 2022 and passed to her son, Charles III, who became King of the UK. All right, she's the longest ruler of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and has the longest British reign. Here are some odd names: Empress Matilda, Lady Jane Grey, and Anne. Empress Matilda is the fourth sovereign of Normandy. She was preceded by her father, Henry I Beauclerc, and ruled concurrently with her uncle, Stephen of Blois. Some people even did not know that she actually was ruler. And she was preceded by her son, Henry II, because of his father being the Duke of Anjou, and her second married husband being the Duke. Her first married husband was the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And her second husband, that's why she's Empress Matilda. And her second husband was the Duke of Anjou. And that's how the Plantagenet dynasty came about, because her son, Henry II, was the first one in that dynasty. Now, her struggling with a divided England, she shares rule with her uncle Stephen of Blois, and it is even unknown if she was ever Queen of England in her day. Next one, Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey is the fourth sovereign of Tudor. She was preceded by her cousin Edward VI and preceded by her other cousin Mary I. She acceded to the throne by being invited to the throne by Edward VI to keep Protestant succession alive for the first time in England. Her reign ended with the usurpation by her cousin Mary, who, with the support of the majority of England's population being Roman Catholic, decided to see a comeback of the old faith. She was executed by Queen Mary I at the Tower of London. All right, so that's Lady Jane Grey. And the last one of a peculiar name is Queen Anne. Queen Anne is the first and only sovereign of Stuart twice restored or resumed from Dutch rule. She's the fourth sovereign of Stuart restored and the sixth sovereign of the Stuart dynasty as a whole. The Stuart dynasty is very fractious, with the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, and then the Restoration, and then the Dutch king coming in the 1690s. So you have that all kind of muddled up, all because of Protestant succession, She was preceded by her brother-in-law, William III, Orange of Nassau, Netherlands, and she was preceded by George I, a distant relative via James I of England, 6th of Scotland, of the House of Hanover in Germany. She acceded to the throne at the death of her brother-in-law, which allowed her to resume the Stuart dynasty for the last time. And in her time, in 1707, the Scottish Parliament dissolved, uniting with Westminster in England, forming the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, or UK. After her death, her distant relative of James I of England and VI of Scotland, due to Protestant succession, took over. Here are the list of monarchs from Norman times for England and the UK after the Union of Crowns, otherwise British Crowns, of 1603. William the Conqueror. Okay, first we have the House of Normandy, 1066 to 1154. William the Conqueror, 1066 to 1087. William II Rufus or Red King, 1087 to 1100. Henry I, 1100 to 1135. Stephen of Blois or Empress Matilda, 1135 to 1154. Then the House of Anjou or Plantagenet, 1154 to 1485. There are three parts to the Plantagenet rule. Plantagenet Major, I call it, 1154 to 1399. Lancaster Plantagenet, 1399 to 1461 and 1470 to 1471. York Plantagenet, 1461 to 1470 and 1471 to 1485. Now, the House of Anjou Plantagenet Major, 1154 to 1399, has 8 monarchs. Henry II, 1154 to 1189. Richard I, the Lionheart, 1189 to 1199. John, 1199 to 1216. Henry III, 1216 to 1272. Edward I, Longshanks, 1272 to 1307. Edward II, 1307 to 1327. Edward III, 1327 to 1377. Richard II, 1377 to 1399. The House of Lancaster Plantagenet took over from 1399 to 1461 and 1470 to 1471. Henry IV Bolingbroke, 1399 to 1413. Henry V, 1413 to 1422. Henry VI, 1422 to 1461 and 1470 to 1471. House of York Plantagenet, 1461 to 1470 and 1471 to 1485. Then we have Edward IV, 1461 to 1470 and 1471 to 1483. Edward V, April to June, so it's June that he died, not July, 1483. Richard III, June 1483 to 1485. By the way, all these dates shout out to the Royal House UK website. House of Tudor, 1485 to 1603. Henry VII, 1485 to 1509. Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547. Shout out to the Sultanate of Malacca that fell in 1511. Edward VI, 1547 to 1553. Lady Jane Grey, 10th to 19th July, 1553. Mary I, 19th July, 1553 to 1558. Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. House of Stuart, Union of Crowns in 1603. It lasted 1603 to 1714, but very fractious, as I said. James I of England and VI of Scotland, 1603 to 1625. Charles I, 1625 to 1649. There's an interregnum or Commonwealth of England from 1649 to 1660. Sir Oliver Cromwell, 1649 to 1658, and Sir Richard Cromwell, 1658 to 1660. The House of Stuart was restored in 1660, first in Scotland and in England, to 1694. Why I put 1694? Because Mary II was the last monarch of this restored house. Her sister Anne came after William, so that is twice restored after that. Charles II, 1660-1685. James II of England and 7th of Scotland, 1685 to 1688. Some people say that 1687 that he went down, but the Glorious Revolution, 1688. So, the Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 1702. William III, House of Orange, Nassau, Netherlands, Dutch rule, 1688 to 1702. Co-monarch with Mary II, House of Stuart restored, 1688 to 1694. So from 1694 to 1702 was Dutch rule. Yeah, House of Stuart twice restored or resumed from Dutch rule, 1702 to 1714. Queen Anne, obviously. Then the House of Hanover, Germany, 1714 to 1840. Why? Because Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha in 1840. Oh well, there's another thing. I did not write Queen Victoria, did I? Preceded by William IV and preceded by Edward VII. I forgot one there. So House of Hanover, Germany. George I, 1714 to 1727. George II, 1727 to 1760. George III, 1760 to 1820. George IV, 1820 to 1830. William IV, 1830 to 1837. Finally, Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1844, until she married Prince Albert. Under the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, it's 1840 to 1917, where Victoria reigned from 1837 to 1901, with having married Albert from 1840 to 1901. Though Albert died in the 1860s, therefore she was still singular monarch, but of a different house now, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, until 1901. Edward VII, 1901 to 1910. George V, 1910 to 1917. House of Windsor. Here is where I want to explain from where I stopped with George V. During the First World War, there was such a thing as Gotha bombers, and the demise of 5 royal houses across Asia and Europe. The Osmanlis of Ottoman Turkey, the Isinjoro of Manchu China, the Hohenzollerns of Germany, the Habsburgs of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Romanovs of Russia had met their end in 1911 China during the Boxer Rebellion, and the 4 empires as a result of socialism during the war. So the fear of the demise of the British Royal House as a result of association with Germany's Gotha bombers, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was a huge concern. Here came rebranding. So hence, Windsor was chosen as a name to replace Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, as it was associated with the age-old castle and royal borough that has long associations with English civilization and heritage. So George V became the first monarch of the House of Windsor, though he reigned as a Saxe-Coburg-Gotha monarch from 1910 to 1917, and from 1917 to 1936 as a Windsor monarch. Though the house, it remains till today, 1917 to present. Okay? Edward VII, January to December 1936. George VI, December 1936 to 1952. Elizabeth II, 1952 to 2022. And Charles III, 2022 to present day, 2025. Here are some of turn of the century monarchs since 1000. The year 1000, Ethelred the Unready, House of Wessex, Anglo-Saxon England. 1100, William II Rufus, or Red King, and Henry I Beauclerk, House of Normandy, Norman, England. 1200, John of the House of Plantagenet, Plantagenet Major, Angevin, England. 1300, Edward I Longshanks, Plantagenet Major, England. 1400, Henry IV Bolingbroke, Lancaster, Plantagenet, England. 1500, Henry VII, Tudor, England. 1600, Elizabeth I, Tudor, England. 1700, William III, Orange, Nassau, Britain. 1800, George III, Hanover, Britain. 1900, Victoria, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Britain. And 2000, Elizabeth II, Windsor, Britain. So that's all for today. I'm going to input the Victoria part into this, and then all you need to do is comment or email me, and I will send you the file free. And maybe we can discuss a bit about history classes on Zoom, if you like, for only $30 a session. Thank you, and have a good day. Where do I stop this? All right, it's ended now.